You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and VERNA Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Somebody there?
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
VERNA Wilson. Hi, everybody.
And today we have another interesting story. Not really a witch, not really an apparition. I guess it could be perceived as an apparition. It's a story from 1894 in a little small town called Woodside in Long Island, New York. It's just about the events that took place about this mysterious old woman with glowing eyes that people kept seeing and around the actual town at the time. So we'll delve into that and see what that's all about, because we like to dig up these old stories that sometimes you find them in the newspapers, sometimes you find them in old books, sometimes you just come across them while looking for something else, which is generally what happens. And you kind of go down a rabbit hole and then you start reading about that. And there's, you just find stories in a lot of different kind of places. And we like to bring these kind of weird stories of the unexplained. All we have is articles to go by sometimes. Whether or not they're real or not, that's up to you. We just report what we find.
I'm not trying to be a jaded city person, but it's amazing what made news back then. I have a feeling if somebody saw a lady like that now, they would think, oh, just another strange person in San Francisco.
Yeah, in San Francisco, this person would be riding the train or the bus and nobody would think twice. Nobody
would think about it, but let's read the article. We'll find out, and let's read the newspaper article, and we'll see whether you would take a second look, or you would just say, somebody's weird.
Exactly.
What else is new?
Okay, we start our story in 1894. Within the span of 4 months, something strange and unsettling occurred in Long Island, New York. A series of unexplained and terrorizing events took place in a small town of Woodside, leaving many residents baffled, and many more were afraid to leave their homes after dark. The following story is based on the events that happened one fall in Woodside. Now, it all began late one August evening near the corners of Betts and Greenpoint Avenues. For those that live there, again, that's Betts and Greenpoint Avenues. That's the corner it started at. When Mrs. Sunker walked past the old Episcopal church that stood on the grassy corner. She hadn't been paying much attention to her surroundings as she felt comfortable in this part of town. Now, it was a route that she'd taken many times before. However, on this particular night, something terrifying was about to cross paths with the young woman. As she made her way past the dilapidated structure, something in the darkness, a swift, fluttering movement, caught her attention. Mrs. Sunker started to pick up her pace when out of the shadows jumped a tall, scraggly woman. Now, the woman had an extremely bony, emaciated face and appeared to be abnormally long and abnormally thin. The haggard woman held a pistol in one hand, waving it in front of Mrs. Sunker's terror-stricken face. Now, the view of the wrong end of the barrel itself wasn't what paralyzed Mrs. Sunker. Neither was the fact that this mysterious woman had jumped out of the shadows that surrounded the church grounds late at night. What made Mrs. Sunker stop dead in her tracks were the deep-set eye sockets that seemed to be hollow, if it weren't for the pair of glowing red eyes. Like two small hot glowing coals in a darkened room, they peered right at Mrs. Sunker's soul. In that moment, she managed to regain enough breath to let out a horrific shriek that cut through the dead sleep of the night.
Before the entire neighborhood could come to Mrs. Sunker's aid, the old hag, had made her way into the church's cellar, so by the time a few passerbyers got to Mrs. Sunker, the commotion had been over. They arrived to see a badly shaken Mrs. Sunker standing near the church, sobbing and waiting, and hoping to leave the premises right away. After they calmed her down, she told the concerned neighbors about the terrifying encounter with the strange-looking woman that lived in the church's cellar. And we don't really know if she lived in the cellar, actually. But none of yeah, that is interesting. None of the neighbors actually had seen or heard anything about anyone living in the old Episcopal church's cellar. As far as they knew, it remained empty since an escaped murderer had made the cellar his temporary home a few years back. Some of the neighbors took Mrs. Sunker into a nearby house while several men armed themselves with whatever they could find nearby. They began a search of the property, starting with the cellar. Several of the men went inside the church while others scoured the nearby areas. After an hour or so of searching, they came up empty-handed. They found no signs of anyone inside the building or anyone making it their place of refuge. The men left the church and they headed a few houses down the street where a trembling Mrs. Sunker had filled in the rest of the neighborhood to see what she had seen near the church grounds. There was an uncomfortable silence as the neighbors looked at one another with fear and concern. The men came in and reported to the crowd they hadn't found anyone inside or near the church property. The silence in the room grew as they all looked at Mrs. Sunker's face for any type of answer. Just then, a blood-curdling scream echoed loud outside, making every single person in the room jump a few inches. "It's coming from the old Gavin place," someone shouted. A few of the men that had returned from searching the church ran out and down the street to a two-story house from where the screams had come from. Inside, they found Mrs. Nellie Gavin passed on the floor. After tending to the young woman, she managed to regain consciousness fairly quickly and proceeded to tell the men about a tall, terrifying figure that she had just seen before everything went dark.
Now, she managed to get the story out through her chattering teeth. Soon they all learned that when Nellie and the two Dower brothers sat on the front stoop of her house that night, they felt as if someone had been watching them. Nellie and her friends were sitting and talking while waiting for her sister to return home. As they joked and talked late that evening, she happened to look across the street and see a strange and really tall woman staring at them from a shadowy patch of woods. Now, whatever it was, it stood motionless, watching their every move, and it didn't take long before they were all up on their feet, ready to book it. Nellie and the two Dower brothers stood in silence, not sure what to do next. Suddenly, the woman from across the street pulled out a long revolver and began running towards the three of them. Nellie let out a resonating scream, and they all split, running in different directions. Nellie ran inside and locked the door behind her. Once inside the safety of her home, she thought about helping her friends if they were still there. Now Nellie peered through the window to see where the brothers were. There was no one here. There was no one nearby her stoop or around the window. The street was empty and silent. Just as she was about to step away from the window, she saw her. Halfway hidden between the shadows was a hideous face, staring right at her through the glass. Nellie passed out, only to awaken in the arms of familiar faces. She had a straw hat and was very tall. She had a long, narrow face. She described the woman to the men who had been chasing this ghostly hag. Nellie went on to tell them that the most terrifying thing about this hideous woman were her eyes. They were set deep in her head and shone like balls of fire. Concern turned into sheer fear for some of those listening to the frightening description of the ghastly woman. Samuel Twaddle, the man responsible for apprehending the outlaw that hid in the church's cellar, stepped up to organize a posse to go and put an end to this mystery that the entire neighborhood awoke in terror. He called on a few men to gather weapons, guns, knives, clubs, axes, torches, anything that is stowed away at home for protection. After seeing how terrified both Mrs. Sunker and Nellie had been after their encounters, the men didn't know what to expect. Now, once gathered outside the church building, Samuel instructed a few men to enter the building from the front, while another group went in through the back. He and others would enter through the cellar, while another man stood guard outside the church. Now, the youngest member of the posse, James MacDonald, was appointed guard in front of the church. The plan was a simple one, as they expected to flush out possibly a vagrant or outlaw trying to make the cellar their hideaway. The groups of men scoured the property looking for the mysterious woman. They checked all rooms, cellar, attic. They checked behind the organ, between every pew, and found nothing but cobwebs, dust, and some residential rodents that called the old building their home. The entire grounds were searched thoroughly, only to come up empty-handed. Only when the men gathered outside the church did they know something was wrong. James MacDonald wasn't in his post. He had gone missing. The young man who had been stationed as a guard was nowhere to be found on the property. They called and began to look for James near the small patch of woods that stretched out just behind the church. It was only after expanding their search that they found him. He had run a few blocks down from the church and was near some train tracks. "I saw it," he sputtered. "I saw the creature. It came running out of the back of the building and headed down to the swamp." He reached his trembling hand up to put a cigarette between his lips. "It's tall," he continued. "It just ran into the swamp." Whatever it was that James had seen was serious enough to make him run away and abandon his post. Now, the men made sure James made it home safe. After searching the area around the swamp, they searched all night and went into the early dawn. They found no traces of whatever had terrified many that night in Woodside. As the light of day pushed through the shadows that surrounded the churchyard, neighbors began recounting the terrors experienced throughout that night. More and more people in Woodside awoke that morning with wild stories of what transpired near the old churchyard. Rumors of ghostly and of illegal activities began to circulate throughout the town, bringing many more concerned people to organize and try and figure out what it was in their town and had to stop it. Now, that same day, as the town struggled to make sense of the strange disturbances, a string of burglaries were being reported across Woodside.
So, on the morning of August 5th, Woodside awoke in a sleep-deprived commotion, and by that afternoon, it was possible that almost the entire town had heard what went on near Betts and Greenpoint about that terrifying-looking and terrifyingly tall stranger with the big straw hat, which they could only assume was used to hide her skeletal face. By that time, there were several patrolling groups of armed men all across Woodside. Samuel Twaddle and his men were still guarding the Episcopal Church. However, this time they paired the MacDonald kid with someone making sure that he wasn't left alone. So the men were posted inside and outside and across the street of the old church. Nothing was to go in and nothing was to come out. It took the effort of almost the entire community to bring some sense of pleasantness back into Woodside. That pleasantness dissipated once reports of burglaries made their way throughout the community. Amidst the commotion and established neighborhood watches across the town, a pair of burglars decided to take advantage of the dire situation the town was in. Several residences and some businesses were hit by a couple of reported burglars. The word started to spread, and soon people all over Woodside were on high alert. There was talk about the burglaries possibly being related to the old strange hag near the church. However, no one, not even the Woodside police, could tie the two incidents together. Soon many people began taking alternate routes when they had to pass by the old Episcopal Church. An ominous reputation had befallen upon the forgotten structure that sat on the intersection of Betts and Greenpoint Avenues. For many of those who were there the first night, the talks of an old witch that lived in the church's cellar had become a living nightmare. As the days turned into weeks, welcoming normalcy began creeping in back into the everyday life of the residents of Woodside. For it seemed that for 2 consecutive days, their bustling little town experienced more activity than decades in Old Salem. So for the next few months, the streets of Woodside became once again busy with pedestrians and children comfortably walking and playing. It had been a few months since the townspeople were under siege by a tall hag with glowing red eyes, or as a general consensus had come to describe the attacker. A slight chill had already crept in as the month of November was coming to an end. So one Monday morning in a quiet street in Woodside Heights, 7-year-old Josie Bogardus plays alone in her front yard. Her father was somewhat nearby. Josie had no idea that as she placed her dolls along the imaginary picnic spread she had set, a man stood across the street hiding and stalking young Josie. Without warning, he ran and lunged at the young girl. The man was on top of her, strangling the young child, restraining her screams for help in her throat. Somehow, Josie managed to escape the man's grip, suck in a lungful of air, and scream for her father's help. When he arrived at the front of his house, Mr. Bogardus was shocked to see a stocky and well-dressed man running away from his front yard where Josie lay crying and gasping for her breath.
A few hours later, around noontime that same day, the well-dressed attacker struck again. This time, 6-year-old Hattie Maxwell was confronted by the same man that had attacked Josie Bogardus. This time, however, the man pulled out a knife. Hattie screamed, and before either of them managed to move a muscle, a wagon made its way around the corner near where the two of them stood. The mysterious attacker quickly ran off when young Hattie was approached by the people driving the wagon. Like wildfire, the word quickly spread across the town of Woodside. With the still glowing embers of what was left from the past August, the growing reports of this new mysterious stranger set Woodside ablaze once more. The following day, 8-year-old Mary Lindblom was on an errand when she became the third child to bump into the mysterious strangler. Mrs. Lindblom sent her daughter Mary to the local grocery store. Now, unaware of the recent attacks on children around the neighborhood, Mrs. Lindblom sent Mary through a route that would take her near an old Baptist church, an area of the neighborhood considered unfavorable by many. Little Mary Lindblom had no idea that she was walking past the church. The well-dressed lunatic waited from behind the bushes. Eager and ready to pounce at her as she got closer, the man leapt out of the bushes and made Mary jump and cry out for help. The deprived lunatic found himself with no time to proceed with whatever macabre plan he had for little Mary. Luckily for Mary, as well as the other children, the attacker was always thwarted off by some passerby in the nick of time. It was after little Mary's encounter that the wildfire could no longer be contained. The entire community of Woodside was on high alert and ready to confront the new danger that threatened their streets. Samuel Twaddle and his men regrouped and armed themselves once again. They, along with other groups, patrolled all the streets of Woodside and the streets of what is today known as Elmhurst, New York. Comprised mainly of angry fathers, the mob of vigilantes wanted justice for these recent and horrifying violent attacks on their daughters. As nighttime fell upon the streets, the relentless fathers continued combing through the streets, but no signs of the creep could be found. They walked and searched the streets until daybreak. Tired and upset, the residents of Woodside were once again left without answers to the strange and unexplained events that seemed to plague their town. It had been disclosed by the Woodside Police Department. They had a few suspects in mind. Now, the New York Times reported that Woodside authorities detained 2 men who had been harassing nearby Hoffman Boulevard, a tall young man dressed in woman's clothing, and a much shorter man who said fit the description of the strangler. Now, the suspicious pair's modus operandi, however, was different than that of the depraved strangler, burglars, or even the remembered ghostly old hag that was said to live in the cellar of what now is known as St. Sebastian Roman Catholic Church building. The 2 young men that had been retained in October seemed to be a pair of losers, taking advantage as well as making light of unfortunate events that had transpired in Woodside. The police knew it, and so did most of the worried residents. Whatever frightened Mrs. Sunker that warm night in August would remain buried and forgotten in the annals of Woodside's history as the world welcomed a new century. The mysterious old hag and the disappearing stranger remained unsolved to this day. Nobody knows why these strange events befell upon Woodside that one unusual August in 1894. Well, there you go. I've not seen any hags or even street or homeless people with glowing red eyes, so I guess that's good.
Well, here's my theory. Okay, it's a small town. Okay, I take back what I said, that she wouldn't be noticed on the bus or whatever. It's a small town, so... It's a small town, and there's...
No one would care.
Well, I know, but it would be very hard in a small, tight-knit community like that for anybody who's different or out of sorts not to be seen or known by people. So I thought I think it was a mentally ill woman who might have escaped from an asylum, who had a gun and was freaked out and didn't know how to handle herself. And she just kind of knew how to blend in near the woods.
Don't they always say? I know that people describe people who have who are rabid, that they have red eyes. Their eyes are really red and swollen.
Sure. Well,
so
sure, and especially if she was ill or if she'd been in an asylum for a long time and she wasn't well and she hadn't been out in the outside worlds, that her eyes might have gotten red, maybe the veins, who knows? You know how it is when your eyes are tired and red. Yeah. And she didn't know how to handle normal people, so she got freaked out.
Well, as a homeless person, you're living against the weather. In this case, August, so it's going to be blistering hot in New York. But I imagine the church basement is cool and someplace to hide out. That's probably why a lot of those vagrants took out refuge in that church building.
Exactly.
Yeah, the revolver, it just doesn't... I guess it doesn't sound paranormal because of the revolver. The glowing red eyes, the fact that they said glowing red eyes instead of their eyes were red and they were crazed, it was a mad woman. The fact that they pointed out that there was glowing red eyes and nobody could find any trace of her anywhere after these incidents is kind of weird, but that doesn't mean she didn't just take off. We don't know.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that would scare anybody. Somebody crazed waving a gun at you, that would scare anyone, especially in a small community like that.
Yeah, but
and then of course it brought out all the local weirdos taking advantage of children and burglaries.
Well, and the tall man dressing up as a woman. I mean, yeah, that's just, I mean that stuff still happens today where they take advantage of a situation. That stuff's been going on forever, so it's just kind of nasty that stuff would happen. But it's weird though. I don't know. Glowing red eyes. You think people would know the difference? I would hope even then they would know the difference between a crazy, homeless hag woman, bag woman with who's obviously mentally ill with a revolver and red eyes versus somebody who has really glowing red eyes.
Well, you know what the glowing red eyes could have been? She could have had an eye problem like pink eye or something, or her eyes could have been swollen and they just looked weird in the dark.
Yeah, that could be. There could be something about her that, the person, they thought they were glowing red. And you know how people, when they hear someone tell a story and then they tell it, sometimes they'll add,
right.
Her eyes were red and swollen. Her eyes were red and swollen becomes, her eyes were glowing red coals,
Well, if she was tall and she looked emaciated, she was probably somebody who didn't get enough to eat, was ill.
Yeah.
So her condition could have looked very exaggerated to somebody who's not used to seeing someone who's not a normal, healthy person.
I mean, it's not like they said, she was floating or she disappeared. She flew over the church.
Kind of stuck around. Yeah.
So, I mean, she just kept reappearing in the neighborhood that night and then she just disappeared. I don't know. This is the problem with some of these old articles is there's a lot of hearsay in eyewitness testimony because the people that know someone that maybe heard something else and they all add their own little 2 cents to the story and it sort of warps and changes and becomes folklore almost. But I mean, I think these stories are interesting, even if this isn't real or didn't really happen as a paranormal angle. I think it's interesting to relay the story and point out what they considered a paranormal event then,
right,
compared
because
to now.
They couldn't find her or she disappeared and they couldn't tell whether it was a real person or just a phantom figure that they saw.
Exactly. So I mean,
it happened in the dark.
I vote it was a strange homeless old woman who just was mentally ill and had other physical problems. And that just because it was at night, the woman was by herself, The woman just thought of it as paranormal. I mean, it happened by a church, which is kind of ironic in a way too. But
Yes.
yeah, that's what I think it was. I don't really think this particular incident probably was paranormal in any way.
I don't either.
What do you think?
No,
All right,
I don't
so I
think it
guess
was paranormal. Yeah, we agree. I mean, I know one of the few times we agree on the same theory.
There you go. So
Yeah.
there we go. The old
And it
hag
just
of
brought out the town's
Woodside.
weirdos.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That kind of stuff happens even today, where something happens and someone else preys on it, and I'll dress up like a woman. They'll think I'm the old hag, and I can rob people and beat people or whatever.
I love these old-fashioned names, Mrs. Sunker or Mr. Twaddle.
Yeah. Yeah,
and they faint. The women faint. I don't see women fainting anymore.
No, women don't faint anymore. They get pissed and they swear and maybe throw things, but I don't think they faint anymore.
Exactly.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know when did fainting stop being a thing? Do we know?
Well, think about it though. Women lived pretty sheltered lives back then, and they probably didn't see a lot of shocking sights. So maybe they were shocked more easily back then.
But they still fainted into the 50s. So maybe in the end of the 60s they stopped fainting.
I guess so.
Maybe that's when Hammer.
I don't hear about fainting when unless somebody has a physical problem and the fainting occurred because something happened, but not because they were shocked by something.
I think about the old Victorian houses, how they had those, what today would be considered an indoor porch to put your boots and hats. Back in the Victorian age was actually a fainting room. You literally would bring someone up the stairs, open the door, and they could collapse into this little room until they composed themselves. People don't realize that's what those little coat rooms in Victorians were fainting rooms. That's why they're built. I didn't know
that. Oh wow. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I know there's a few historical. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that next time I go into an old house, because there's a lot of old houses here in the Bay Area where they still have rooms like that.
You think to yourself, oh, look, they built a little alcove in here so I can put my coat on the wall, a coat rack, and my shoes and boots and hats and gloves and maybe a little table. No, that's there because a chair was usually sitting there, so the woman could be brought into the house and she could collapse in the fainting room and compose herself before she went back into the house.
Oh, wow. Well, you know what? Maybe one of these days I'll sit on one of those little chairs if they're still there, and I'll pretend like I'm fainting.
There you go. See, you're like, oh, quick, get me up the stairs so I can collapse in the fainting room. So I just thought that was interesting when I heard that. It was on a walking tour of San Francisco, Victorian walking tour. And I had no idea. That's cool. So unusual. I'd never heard that before. But there you go.
I know there's a few historical apothecary places where they make smelling salts still.
They still use those to some degree, I think. In some places.
They do. They make smelling salts. They use smelling salts, or they use lavender water or eau de cologne. To bring them back.
So next time, Verna, when you see that hag woman with a revolver and glowing red eyes, and you rush into the house, you can faint in your little chair.
Okay.
See, you're fainting.
I don't have a little chair like that.
Just put one by the door and pretend it's your fainting room. If someone asks, "Why are you sitting down?"
I have one to an old desk that I have, so maybe I'll use that chair.
There you go. Oh, what are you doing here? What are you fainting here for? Oh, it's my fainting room. I couldn't possibly faint in my room or in my apartment.
So I'll faint in here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can laugh at me.
I'll know what you're doing. No one else will.
No one else will, and you can laugh at me. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
And everybody will look at you saying, "How rude! He's laughing at her."
I'm like, quiet. Verna's in her fainting room. But there you go.
Like
so
I'm looking.
The old hag of Woodside, New York, Long Island. I don't even know where Woodside is. I mean, there's so many little small pocket towns in New York, that I walk
Yeah.
all the way through Long Island City, so I probably walked through this and didn't even know it was Woodside during the big
Mm-hmm.
brown out in the 2000s.
Didn't they say it's
Yeah,
Elmhurst, New York now? It's the town
yeah,
has been
that's
renamed.
exactly. It turned into Elmhurst, New York. So I mean, if you've ever lived or gone to New York or in neighborhoods, Brooklyn and Long Island City or whatever, there's a lot of little tiny towns that are probably just given old names because they were smaller, but now they're just
Mm-hmm.
boroughs of neighborhoods because obviously times change, the boroughs become bigger, and then these little towns just become a little sliver of a borough. Like we have like Dog Patch and things like that
Mm-hmm.
become parts of neighborhoods instead of towns.
Sure.
So, but it's an interesting story. I like finding weird stories like this.
I do too. I wonder if the residents who had a grandfather or grandmother or great grandparent remember this story.
1894. They would have, or
It
I don't know,
wouldn't be
even
that long
someone who would
ago.
be. Well, no, that's 135 years ago. They'd be
Yes,
dead. Most of them would be dead.
my father had grandparents born in the late 1800s. They lived all the way to the 1950s, 40s,
Yeah, but being it's
and later.
2020, this would be make it 100 and what is that? 25, 26 years? I don't
Yeah,
think
but there's
anybody would
family
be alive.
stories.
Yeah, family stories. Yeah, like did you hear the story about great great grandma and the old hag, that kind of stuff?
Something like
She
that.
saw a
Yeah,
hag with glowing red eyes.
exactly.
Yeah, that'd
Right,
be
right.
funny. To like even a diary, like a family diary, to see someone write about an incident like this would be very interesting. Anyway,
So,
that's our story. It's our episode this week of the Hag of Woodside. So if you live in Woodside or Elmhurst, New York, be on the lookout for that crazy tall hag woman with a revolver and glowing red eyes late at night. Try
yeah,
to
tell
avoid
us
her.
about it.
Yes, if you encounter her, tell us about it. See if you can go back and get her on the show. We'd love to talk to her.
Sure, or if there's a
I
local
know.
town weirdo you know about, we'd like to hear about them.
Well, maybe not. Not maybe not. Just
If
saying.
it's
I
in
don't know
that,
if I
if
want
it's
to
in a
talk to her.
historical town like that, sure.
But a
At least I
cross-dressing
would.
like child attacker, maybe not. Maybe not that. I don't
Okay,
think we'd
not
want to
that.
talk about
No,
that.
not the one who attacked children. I don't want to hear about that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, that's it, folks. So until next week, we'll say goodbye.
Bye. See you next week.
Bye. Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.